Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. There's something about small towns that I absolutely love. I spent a lot of time in them as a young child, and as an adult, I go out of my way to visit them. I find them charming, but I also find them mysterious. I love that they ultimately hold so many secrets, tied in with their long history, where the walls and the very streets that you walk on are forged with secrets of success, melded with secrets of distress. Small town life, small town business. You don't have to take my word for it, though. Take the stories of others. Take their first-hand experiences and form an opinion of your own, right here on The Darkest Hour. So, let's get started, shall we? When I was younger, I remember my mom having a mirror in her room that would sometimes show faces and shadows that weren't there. This wasn't only at night, so over the years I've ruled out the possibility that these experiences were dreams. I was very little, but what I was seeing wasn't something of a child's imagination. I was a relatively sheltered child, meaning I hadn't seen horror movies or scary things outside of costumes during the holiday season, which weren't scary to me. What I saw in the mirror, that was scary to me. Some background. I come from, and at the time I lived in an old mining town, Farmington, West Virginia. In 1968, there was a pretty big explosion in the Mount Hope mine. It ended up killing 78 men, while only 21 managed to make it out alive. Most all of these men were locals. This was an up-and-running mining town, years before the explosion. So what this had essentially done to our very small town was take out an entire generation of men, for some families. So what my mom saw growing up was a town with a lot of widows and not a lot of children. But when I was growing up, what I saw was a lot of old people, mainly women, some kids, and a whole lot of estate sales. Makes sense when you put together that a lot of these people had either outlived their family or had never had children, leaving most of their physical belongings to the state. Enter the mirror. My mom had found it at one of these estate sales and she couldn't let it go. It was an old mirror, but fancy carvings, and it had deep reddish wood. The front opened, making it a sort of extra-large jewelry box. Before the mirror, my mom had a small TV stand and TV that sat at the foot of her bed. So at night, I'd grab a stuffed animal or two, and I'd just curl up at the foot of her bed and watch TV. After my mom moved the TV into the front room, she put the mirror in its place in her room. Still fixed on my routine, I decided that I would sleep at the foot of my mom's bed, this time bringing a flashlight with my stuffed animals, along with a book. Falling asleep was no problem, but I started to experience waking up for no reason. I remember waking up, barely having my eyes open but seeing faces in the mirror. I'd open my eyes wider, trying to rub them, but the faces wouldn't go away. I couldn't make out any details like eye color or hair color. It was just like seeing the imprint of a face, sometimes silver and resembling the texture of water, sometimes black like a shadow, and other times white like a sheet. What I remember more than any feature is being so scared that I had to jump into bed with my mom. But most of the time, the faces would stay in the mirror. moving their position from lower to higher, as I did. There was a period of time where I tried to tell my mom about the faces. She told me it was probably because I kept smushing my face into the mirror and that I was leaving an imprint, or if it was at nighttime, that it must have been a dream. I understood quickly that my mom clearly couldn't see what I was seeing. Then the shadow started happening, and I was no longer alone. I was usually in my mom's room because that's where my cats liked to sleep during the day, so I'd always find myself in there, sprawled out on her bed, petting the cats. When I would get up, I'd usually catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, looking like a shadow passing by, but nothing to make a shadow. The first time that this happened, I froze in fear. I thought something was in the room with me, but after several moments I realized I was alone, at least alone in this room. But there was a shadow in the mirror. It only seemed to be showing a sliver of itself, to the far right, my right. I kept looking from the mirror and then next to me. It wasn't adding up. I'm not sure how I gained the courage to leave the room that time, but I did, running from her room down the stairs. After that time, I just got used to it. The shadow and the faces. I kinda hated them, but I was used to them. And so one day, my mom calls me from her room. I was in my room. I scooted my way down the hall, and she looked puzzled, asking if I was just in there, meaning, was I just in her room? I told her no, that I was in my room the whole time. She shrugged this off the first time, but when it happened more than once, she started to ask questions about the stories I would tell her about the mirror. So I repeated that I would sometimes see faces. I was more articulate now, so my descriptions of their colors and textures, it was better. She seemed to listen more, and sometimes we'd be sitting in her room, and she'd ask me, "Did you see that?" When a shadow would go by. I had seen it, and each time it was like confirmation that something was happening. After a while, I guess I stopped paying much attention to the mirror, and I thought my mother did too. The mirror was damaged while we were moving several years later. It was weird. When I heard it was damaged, I actually felt sad. And when I saw my mom, she was devastated, as I guess that she'd grown a bit attached to it, a bit more than I even knew until it was gone. It's hard to explain, but I don't have a lot of memories growing up. I mean, I remember some things, but I can never usually recall what I did for a certain birthday, who my teachers were. I even have a hard time remembering the kinds of shows that were on TV, or my friends' faces. But I have vivid memories of the faces and the shadows in the mirror. It's like when I talk about them, I'm transported right back to the front of that mirror, seeing these faces and shadows, my knees feeling like jello. I don't really know what to make of it all. It really was the strangest thing. I love road trips. There's nothing more delightful to me than to get up an hour before the sunrise and hit the road to a destination some 100 miles in the distance. However, there are occurrences in the wee hours when time gets thin and reality blurs around the edges. I'd like to share 3 of these stories that all share a phenomenon I've come to call the screaming between. The first was during my move from North Carolina to California. I made it in a 4-day blitz across the continental U.S., which I was pretty proud of. Day 1 passed with no trouble, moving from Goldsboro, North Carolina, to Prattville, Alabama, in just 12 hours. Day 2, I got all the way from Prattville to Baton Rouge, and I knocked off early to enjoy some gumbo. Day 3 was the day that I heard it. It was about 4 in the afternoon, with a relatively clear day all around me. October isn't the hottest time in Texas, but my AC had quit working, so I had the windows down. V&V Nation's Nemesis was blaring out of my shitty Honda Civic speakers when I heard a god-awful shrieking. It was like the sound of a big sheet of steel being torn lengthwise. In a panic, I pull over into a small turnabout on the side of I-10. And before I can even figure out what's going on, rain is hitting my car. A couple drops, then a torrent, and just ahead of me where the road dips a bit, I see a runnel of water start. I look to my left, down to the south, and this massive thunderhead is pulling from behind a butte, and this wall of water is starting to pour across the road. I never saw anything like that before, and I was stranded for a good 40 minutes as this flash flood poured not about 20 feet ahead of my car across the road. The next time was a road trip to Idaho, from my new home in California. I took the route up through Nevada via Amboy and Vegas, figuring I could do the trip in about a day since the GPS predicted 12 to 13 hours for a drive. The snow was starting to come down as this was a Christmas trip, my favorite time of the year to take these journeys, visit family and friends. I had gotten roughly halfway there, around the town of Wells. It's honestly a bunch of truck stops and hotels, more of a stopover than a real town. And I was starting to get drowsy. I'd taken longer than expected due to the major traffic holdup a few hours before, and it was already pitch black around 11:30 p.m. I had just rolled down the window to let a blast of cool air invigorate me when I heard it, that same horrifying shriek sound. I jerked the wheel reflexively, and I skidded off the road. At exactly that moment, an oncoming semi drifted right into the lane that I'd been in. The last story is another Christmas road trip. This time, I was going from California all the way to Illinois, and just my luck, a winter storm comes tearing along I-70 just as I'm getting on during day 2 of my trip. It was insane. I'd gone from a slightly snowy but mostly clear day in Utah to near whiteout conditions in under an hour. Now, I'm perfectly comfortable driving in the snow, and my SUV had its snow chains, 4-wheel drive, everything in good condition. I'd replaced the Honda Civic a while back. So I figure I can keep going. A few hours more, at least. Then, of course, I hear it. That infernal hell shriek of a sound. This time, I could swear I heard it saying 13 as it screamed through the winter snow. By this time, I'm entirely out of fucks to give when it comes to that screaming, so I hit the next exit and ducked into a hotel, even though it was only 7 p.m., and I'd been on the road for less than 9 hours. The next day, as I'm driving, I counted 12 vehicles on the side of the road, overturned and wrecked, each one with massive gashes on the sides of their vehicle, like they'd been peeled back by a horrible force. I still love road trips, but part of me is always listening for that screaming when I'm between towns. Around a decade ago, I experienced what can only be called an inner body hallucination. It started with a numb feeling in my ankle that slowly spread up my leg over time. But when the feeling got to my knee, things got very weird. It felt like there was a direct link between my ankle and my neck, to the point where if one moved, the other moved automatically, at the exact same time, the exact same amount. It was not possible for me to stop one from moving when I moved the other. And they would move at a precision that would take someone a very long time to be able to fake these involuntary movements. Obviously, this started freaking me out, hardcore. And luckily, I'd already been taken to the hospital, where I was in the waiting room. While this was happening to me, the feeling kept crawling up my body, now affecting both of my legs. Eventually, it reached my rib cage, and that's when things truly started to get freaky. It felt like the bones in my rib cage were slowly starting to come loose and float around in my stomach in a clockwise manner that exactly matched the rhythm of my breathing. Now, by this time, I was completely hysterical, as it truly felt like my bones were coming loose, and I was convinced I was dying. This went on for over 30 minutes, me hysterical, feeling incapacitated. The doctors and nurses had managed to move me to X-ray, where they took an X-ray of my chest and showed it to me, explaining that I was fine. It was then that I finally began to understand that nothing was happening to me and that it was all in my head. The doctors at the hospital obviously assumed that I was on some sort of hallucinogen, so I was tested for every drug they could think of. But I came back completely clean, which I knew I would. They were completely mystified as to what could have caused it, as I'd never had anything remotely similar happen in the past. The scariest part was that it felt so real. It felt no different than any other physical sensation in my body. And it dawned on me, I would not be able to trust my physical senses. There was no difference between the hallucinated physical sensations and any other sensations I had or have ever felt. Over 10 years later now, and I still do not know what causes it. From time to time, if I think about it too much, I will have ripples of the effects occur. Specifically, it will feel as if a bone near my kidney or some other organ in that area is coming loose and revolving in a circle around that organ with each breath I take. I haven't really ever told this story to many people, as I know most would just assume I'm fucking crazy. I didn't really like the church that our family went to growing up. It was a small church, but it had those really high vaulted ceilings and only one window besides the door itself. In front of the window and behind the podium, hanging from above the rafters, was one of those really large statues of Christ on a cross. It was actually an agonizing sight, especially when you're just 5 years old. My first real memories of this place were from around that age, so it was back in 1988. And where I grew up in West Virginia, my town was small. And I don't know what it's like now, but in Clearview at the time, this was the main church. There were, of course, others, even in a town with less than 1,000 people. But this was a special church. This was because the preacher claimed to have been touched by God himself. I'll get to that later. But chronologically speaking, the first experience I had was sitting outside the steps of the church, just waiting to go inside while Mama talked with some friends. I was twirling around my Barbie doll, and I glanced over at the church, where just to the right of the entrance I saw a little girl. She was only poking her head and her shoulders out, the rest of her tucked behind the building. I was instantly curious because I didn't know her, and I'd known all of the little girls, I thought. I remember running towards her, my mama calling after me, and the girl dissipated right in front of me. I watched as she went from being there to being nothing. I was now being scooped up by Ma, and we were heading into the church. I was the only one who saw the little girl, I guess, and I would see her again. Sometimes it would be the exact same spot. Sometimes I'd see her sitting in the church, or I'd hear her run away. She never spoke to me, but I felt like she could tell that I could see her. I don't remember seeing her past the 2nd grade, but after that, I started to notice other things. Aside from the larger-than-life Jesus staring down every Sunday, you had the odd happenings surrounding the piano, where it always seemed like it needed to be replaced or repaired in some way. We would be singing, the church would be filled with noise, and then suddenly you'd hear the piano go out, and everyone would stop. I remember this happening all the time, and as I got older, I noticed that this would coincide with things like a light going out, or the sound of someone walking above us. There was no above us, only a vaulted ceiling with a roof atop. No attic, no basement. This was a single-story building, and yet footsteps above. All of the children seemed to notice these steps, and if the adults heard them too, they dismissed them, maybe as birds. And then there was the preacher, the outrageous preacher who said that angels were dancing on the roof. I remember hearing these insane stories at church, and then questioning them when we got into the car, like asking Mama why the preacher was always yelling. I would ask why he had to grab onto people and shake them, get in everyone's face. Why do you have to do that? She would laugh and laugh, saying he's exactly the kind of man that we need to run that church, to help this town. That he was a man touched by God, and that he was going to bring truth and salvation to our small hillside. He was the answer to our prayers. But what prayers? I didn't feel like we needed anything in our lives. Had we even sinned enough to need to be saved? And every Sunday at that? I didn't press the issue. As an adult, I'm not religious. Not like that. But back then, you just didn't question the church. And you sure as shit didn't question God. So for years, I would attend the church. And through the years, I at least talked with my friends about the preacher, the church, the little girl. Others had seen her too. One girl claiming that her sister, her little sister, could still see her. I had witnesses to what I was seeing, so I knew that it was real. But it didn't hit me until years later what that could mean. The outrageous preacher ended up being a bit of a scam artist. Shocker, I know. He'd taken the church's money and pulled an identical scam a couple of states over, just before hitting West Virginia. Before the days of heavy internet access and cell phones, he'd gotten away with quite a lot. However, he did end up dying in a car accident while driving under the influence. So, as Mama said, he got his. The preacher that replaced this man, he was a good man, like an actual good man, one that took up and moved his family to Clearview. I still didn't care much for church, but at least this guy wasn't yelling at us. It was the year before Mama passed away in 2002 that he gave my friends and I the real story and history behind this church. Years before any of us were born, sometime in the 1950s, this was a 2-story chapel, and there was a young girl who had died there. How? Was the first question that everybody had asked before the preacher could even finish telling the story. He told us that we needed to be prepared for the morbid and tragic truth. At which time, we all sort of understood that this was a serious story, and that the excitement we were feeling was maybe misguided. Either way, I needed to hear the rest. When he felt we were listening, he told us that a fire was reported and attended to almost immediately after smoke was seen. But even though they were able to get the fires put out, and only the top floor had been destroyed, they'd made a terrible discovery while putting the fire out. Firefighters had found the partial remains of an unidentified little girl. I remember my friends and I sitting very still, one of them saying, "Wasn't she no one's little girl?" Apparently people had known this story, I just wasn't one of them, I thought. But she was right. The preacher told us that no one came forward to claim the little girl, and no missing children reports ever came through the area. Investigators still don't know much about the little girl, and they never learned what caused the fire or who was responsible for any of it. Basically, it was a tragic mystery for years, and the church remained partially charred until 1975, when it was refurnished into a one-story, small chapel that I'd grown accustomed to. Never fond of, but familiar with. I don't go back much since Mama passed away, but I do plan to take my kids there sometime. They get a real kick out of this story each time I talk about back in the day. I joked that we gotta wait for a grandkid to show up, since they'll likely be the only ones to see the little girl. Part of me feels happy that people continue to bring their kids to church, even if I wasn't much for it. I like the thought of that little girl having company. If she was stuck here for some reason or by choice, at least she didn't have to be stuck alone. I've been a property manager for a little over a decade now, but the first property I was hired on to manage almost made me rethink my career choice. A resident overdosed in their apartment, and I found them when coming to address their second month's past due rent. Before I got to the door, I noticed the red envelope I delivered last month. It still lay unopened on her welcome mat. The mailbox next to her door was also full. It too had a letter taped on the lid from the post office, informing the resident of paused deliveries due to its capacity. Observations of this kind led me to believe the occupant had bailed on their lease. When I knocked, it sounded like animal scratches were coming from the back bedroom. The thought of them abandoning their dog is what prompted me to enter the unit and check. The apartment hung with a thick, sickening odor that still makes me retch thinking about it. Thankfully, I didn't find any animals. Unfortunately, I did find the body of a young woman. The situation, although tragic, is also an unfortunate common part of my job, at least in the town where I live. Because a lot of the time, where people live is also where they die. The next day, cleaning crews were in. None of the family notified showed up to claim any of her belongings, so it was protocol for maintenance to take it all to the dump. One of the maintenance men stopped by my office with a box of books and said that it would be a shame to discard such literature, and he offered them to me. I agreed with him, and I gladly took the box of books. When I brought the box home, I began to unpack my new books. Stashed amongst the hardback novels, I discover a diary. Immediately, I realize it's that girl's diary. And for the next 2 days, I struggle with the dichotomy of sadness and morbid curiosity. But I decide to read it. Not for entertainment, but to honestly explore another human being's point of view. What decisions led her to where I found her? That's where our story began together. But why? I'd spent weeks reading through her diaries, almost feeling beside her as she reached to understand not only herself, but the relationships that she had around her. Loves who didn't love back, and loves that she only pretended to love because she was tired of waiting. She even mentions me a couple of times from our interactions when she first moved in. Some pages were decorated in intricate self-portraits, but most with incoherent rants, a mess of scattered words, if put together, probably resembled messages of SOS, buried amongst the hardback novels. Near the end of her diary, though, she begins referencing a demon that followed her home. The tone of her writing also shifts at this point, her entries less frequent and looking more like a checklist of daily tasks rather than an analysis of happenings like they once were. Aside from her last entry, I am writing an exact excerpt from her diary. The walls of my apartment bleed with sin. The demons live here now. After that whole incident, the energy never really felt comfortable in that unit. I felt it. The maintenance people felt it. New residents even mentioned feeling weird during our open house showings. Maybe I wouldn't have such a weirded out perception of this place if I didn't read the girl's diaries. But I do think that the sorrow she wrote about, it somehow stained the energy there. When I was in high school, I worked as a pizza delivery guy. It actually was almost as humiliating as a lot of feature films made it out to be. At least in my town, which tended to be a stereotypical small town. The people I worked with were either nerds, like me, or dudes that hated nerds, like me. My manager was somewhere in the middle. He was a dude who'd been working there since high school, and he had no real plan B. So as it would turn out, he was still working there. He was just much older and a bit more out of touch. We'll call him Carl. Carl wasn't so bad. Sure, he was a bit of a nervous, uptight kind of guy, but that didn't usually come out when he was working with me. Those attributes were reserved for the more difficult employees. Employees like the dude we'll call Steve. Steve was a mess. Both literally and metaphorically. Like starting unwarranted food fights in the back room, blaming it on the new chick before asking her out on a date. That kind of mess. I hate to say it, but Steve was also one of those guys that seemed to be a little too aggressive with animals, or just didn't get it. There was an assembly once, my freshman year, Steve's senior year, and he actually spray painted a dog in the middle of the gym. When he first walked out, you could have heard a pin drop, it was so quiet. But once he started to actually spray the dog, horrified gasps filled the gym, followed by screaming. Just sheer panic at 2 o'clock in the afternoon before the big game. Anyways, as it relates to work, Steve was the guy who would always send me, and I'm sure anyone he worked with, on the shitty delivery runs. The runs where you knew you weren't going to be getting any tips. He also liked to send people on fake deliveries to real houses. And on the occasion that people would actually just take the pizza, yeah, that had to come out of the delivery person's paycheck. So, on top of stealing everyone's tips, he was also shorting our checks. Eventually, Carl started to catch on to this madness. We'd gotten a lot of complaints, so Steve had been reprimanded. Not fired, but he was the delivery boy now. Now look. No disrespect to the man that I'm calling Steve, and I am by no means insinuating that Steve had anything coming to him or that he deserved anything negative to happen to him. I am only telling you all of this to paint a picture of who Steve was to me, and how Steve's world crossed into mine in this lifetime. How he became the legend, if you will. It was a Saturday morning, and I didn't work Saturdays, so usually I slept in. This was a different kind of Saturday, though, because my mom was waking me up, telling me that my boss was on the phone, and that there was an explosion down Dorse Trail Loop last night. I realized that she was jazzed up on coffee, so she was really just giving me the morning scoop. Carl was on the line, though, asking if I'd come in to work the night shift. I agreed, no big deal, but I asked what about Steve? What happened to him working tonight? Carl paused briefly and told me he'd explain it to me tonight if he could.
Now, whether he was supposed to tell me or not, I don't know, but it would only be a few more days before the rest of the town knew anyways. But as it turns out, Steve had started to take up interest in chemistry and decided to try his hand at cooking his own meth. Unfortunately, this hobby took his life because he wasn't very good at it and because meth is incredibly dangerous. But he does live on in spirit. Some say that if you head down Dorst Trail Loop, where his trailer used to sit, you can see him walking about. I think that's probably just something that some insensitive kids made up, if I'm being honest. But fact, Dorst Trail Loop actually has park benches and picnic tables. It's a whole little park in our area now, so that's really nice. Sometimes I think maybe Steve left his property to the city in a will or something. I'm sure that I could find that out if I tried hard enough, but I like to think that he just did. That he's one of those people that gets to live on as the legend versus the man. So, rest in peace, Steve. Rest in peace.
This happened about 4 years ago, in 2016. It's autumn time, and I'm driving to go pick up my girlfriend to get some food. I'll never forget glancing down at the clock to notice that the time was 8:30 p.m., and so the sun was beginning to set. I go and I've picked her up, but for some unknown reason, I decide to take a shortcut and drive through a notoriously haunted road. Background info: this road is situated exactly between a huge cemetery where many of my family are buried and a crematorium. I personally know 2 people that have died in a car crash around here. However, I have actually been down this road many times over the years, and I've never experienced anything remotely paranormal. In general, I've always considered myself to be a calm, rational, logical person, and I was always on the fence when it came to the paranormal. That is, until this day. Now bear in mind that these 2 adjoined long stretches of road, Park Lane and Forge Lane, used to be national speed limit roads, which means that in the UK, you're legal to drive up to 60 miles an hour. The limits on these particular roads have been changed and lowered since. But I bring it up so that you're aware that I'm completely focused, alert, and I have my wits about me while driving on this road. Also bear in mind this: these roads have absolutely no streetlights. The only form of lights are the cat eyes that are built into the road, which reflect off of cars' headlights and show the path. And there are no sidewalks on this road, and that's important for later. So I'm cautiously driving at a high speed, and I'm fully aware of my surroundings. We continue moving along, and quickly we've reached the halfway mark of these 2 connected roads. This is the point where the trees surrounding each side of the road kind of form a tunnel. This only managed to add to the eeriness. As I'm driving along, I suddenly notice a distant figure up ahead, 100 yards. He just sort of happened to be there from seemingly nowhere. So as any sane driver would do when they see a person standing in the middle of the road, I instinctively took my foot off of the gas until I realized something. There are no sidewalks for pedestrians to walk on, and it's a 60-mile-an-hour road. My mind instantly began going into overload. I started to go through a series of questions in my head. An absolute flood of emotions and sense of dread started to creep in. But I quickly reminded myself that I need to remain calm, driving on this very dangerous, unlit road. As I get closer and closer, to within less than 50 yards, I can finally make out a bit more detail. It's now that my emotions really start to run wild. My hands are shaking, and tears are rolling down my face, and I'm beginning to sweat profusely. All because I'm gradually starting to come to terms with what is in front of me. And I had been unsuccessful in quickly trying to debunk this whole scenario in my head. I'm almost in disbelief with what I'm seeing in front of me. I see a brown-robed figure. No face, no feet,
He's just in the middle of the road, hovering. Then, almost as if he sensed that I was coming closer, I'm now within less than 10 yards. He literally drifts to the side of the road, into some nearby bushes, and completely vanishes. I barely maintain my composure long enough to finish driving to the end of the road, where I managed to park up. I was speechless. My face had gone so pale, and I was drenched in sweat. With tears still coming out of my eyes, I sat there for a full 10 minutes, just trying my hardest to debunk and comprehend what I'd just seen. But the truth was that there was no streetlights or other lights that could have somehow caused a visual misinterpretation. There were no paths for a random person to enter this section of the road. No other sort of interference from other external sources. And no headlamps from any cars coming in the opposite direction whatsoever. I eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, began processing in my mind that the only thing I could come up with was that I'd witnessed a full-body apparition of a brown-robed Benedictine monk. And do you know what the funniest thing about all of this is? My girlfriend was there the whole journey, but she had her head down, looking at her mobile phone the whole time. Although later on, she did actually end up having an experience of her own after seeing a different kind of apparition another time on the same road. This whole experience ended up having such an impact on me that I began doing some background research into the area. Sometime later on, I managed to discover two very specific details about the area. One, an actual monastery used to exist there, back in the 19th or 13th century. I also found a website dedicated to my city, just a generic website about the history of the city. However, I managed to find a thread. It was about the ghosts, locations in and around our city. And finally, after browsing through some 12 pages within it, I eventually find a comment by someone that also mentions seeing a monk.
Well, friends, that's the end of tonight's episode. A big thank you to everyone who shared their stories. And of course, to everyone for listening. Be sure to join me every Friday night at 11 p.m. And if you want to keep listening to the show and you never want it to end, be sure to subscribe to the Darkest Hour YouTube page. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com. And check out our subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.